Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the webinar today. I'm Kathy Espinoza, and I will serve as your host. Please feel free to ask questions as we go through the webinar this morning by placing them right into the chat window, which is on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. The questions will be sent to me, and we will be answering them at the end today. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter this morning, Dr. Scott Poland. Dr. Poland is a professor and co-director of the Suicide and Violence Prevention Office at Nova Southeastern University in Florida. He is a licensed psychologist and internationally recognized expert on youth suicide, self-injury, and school crisis. Now, you may recognize his name because he is an author on many of our Teen and Safe Schools courses and has provided multiple webinars for us in the past. Dr. Poland, we appreciate your time this morning and your expertise today. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
The reality is I did work full-time in schools as a psychologist for 26 years, but now I'm at the university level, and I think in some ways that it's much more challenging to be a teacher, an administrator, a counselor today. And I know that a number of counselors have talked with me about all the drama on Monday morning because of all the social media and all the activity over the weekend. So it can be quite challenging, and I know that in particular that different administrators have talked about it's really somewhat of a slippery slope to try to figure out how much to get involved, what to do. And to be honest, I think a lot of schools have thought, well, okay, it happened over the weekend. What does that really have to do with us at school? But the reality is it almost always impacts learning, and that is the business of schools. And if we just look quickly at some of the data, and certainly the U.S. Department of Education Stop Bullying Now website is a very important resource. I imagine everybody listening is aware that in particular the bullying tends to peak in middle school, but it certainly does go on through high school as well. And as a psychologist, everything is really about early intervention. And when do we intervene, and how can we head off some of these potential problems? And I spoke to sixth graders' parents the other day, and basically my message to them was something like this: all the technology, it is a privilege, it's not a right, and take charge of it. And I actually got some really good feedback from the principal because they called me the next day and said, well, the parents of our sixth graders wanted you to come back to the school. And I was sort of like, why would I come back? And the principal said, that's because they want you to tell their children why they're going to do some things differently. And last week I did a presentation following a program called Screenagers. And I'm wondering if any of you have seen this particular documentary, because it's certainly eye-opening in terms of trying to get our attention about how the technology has pretty much consumed children in our country. But I ask all the parents to stand up to find out how many elementary parents, how many middle school, how many high school parents, because the bottom line is high school students are used to a certain amount of time online, and we are not going to dramatically change that. It's more important that we start with younger children. But the cyberbullying in particular, it involves harassing, mocking, and threatening others via social media. And schools have a lot of excellent resources in terms of technology specialists that can really help parents keep up with what is the latest thing that I need to be aware of. They can do that through presentations to parents. They can do that through articles and newsletters. But as I stated, the cyberbullying is particularly challenging because it does occur online and away from campus. And then throughout all of the aspects of bullying, and this, of course, is National Bullying Prevention Month, but throughout, whether it's bullying in person, whether it's bullying online, they're really intertwined, and a real common denominator is that kids, for the most part, do not come forward and tell adults. And then the challenge is to try to understand, why don't they tell us if they're being bullied, either in person or online? And the bottom line is they'll often say something like, I was afraid it would only get worse. I didn't think the adult could actually do anything that might stop it. I've become increasingly aware of an organization called Common Sense Media, and I would really encourage everybody to visit the website. I first became aware of it because, as you know, I've done a number of webinars on the many unsafe messages in 13 Reasons Why, that popular Netflix program. But Common Sense Media basically rates movies, television programs, video games, and gives parents some really good guidance in terms of what is appropriate developmentally. And there you see some rather staggering figures about how many teenagers are online almost constantly. Well, many of them are multitasking. Principal was talking to me just this last week about they get complaints from the parents that my high school kid is doing homework for like 6 hours a night. Well, we really have to separate out how much of it was really homework, how much of it was chatting with friends online, and we often all feel like we multitask, and that really goes great. However, the research really says multitasking doesn't work so well. We may be really off a little bit on how well we think we are doing with the multitasking. So there's a figure, 25% of kids experience cyberbullying. Then here's the most interesting figure from Common Sense Media, and that is basically kids would do a lot differently if the adults were actually monitoring. And I think what we really have to do with kids is make sure that we are very clear in what our expectations are for them. And of course, again, it's a privilege, not a right, and parents should freely and easily check and make sure they know what is going on. So in the opening, I raised the question, is it really the responsibility of schools? And I'm going to say yes. It's yes because it's almost always going to impact learning. Then we might get into the argument about what about the First Amendment and protected free speech. And I researched there have actually been several cases that have gone to court about this, and basically speech loses its protection when it's considered foreseeably disruptive or possibly a true threat. But administrators talk to me about, well, it's quite a challenge because, I mean, you're investigating and the parents of the victim may be happy with you trying to do something, but the parents of the perpetrator may be very defensive and want to know why you are getting involved in their kid's business. But it comes back to the impact on learning. Where do we start with all of this? We have to start in very early grades with good supervision, with helping kids understand they need to put their best foot forward. They're establishing essentially a digital reputation. They need to be aware of the many miscommunications that can happen. There have been people that are arguing that a lot of our young people don't really know how to develop friendships because they're not developing them the way that we used to through face-to-face interactions. And I know when I was growing up, basically my home was a safe haven. The once I walked in that door, essentially no one could reach me. And there was actually a phone with a cord on it. Hopefully some of the listeners actually remember that. And I swear to you, my mother sat next to it my entire adolescence. So it was a lot different. And this makes it incredibly challenging for parents today to keep up. And how much training needs to be devoted to this? In presenting in one school district recently, I asked some teachers, how much time was spent this August before the first bell rang? How much time was spent on bullying prevention and cyberbullying prevention? And the answer was virtually none. So we really need to make this a priority. And California is actually a leader in developing state legislation about bullying prevention. So there is what the latest data says about kids and screen time, 6.5 hours. By the way, what does the American Medical Association say? No more than 2 hours. Now, part of this needs to be broken down more by ages. And I would think that 2 hours is certainly plenty of online time for an elementary age child, but for a high school student, it could be longer, and that would be acceptable. It interferes not only with relationships, as I mentioned, but it also interferes with sleep. Kids are basically sleeping with the technology right on their pillow. I had this conversation after a parent talk in Atlanta not long ago, because I was basically saying to the mom of the 13-year-old and to everyone, tell your child it's time to go to bed. I need your iPad, your cell phone, your laptop. They will all be charged, and I'll hand them back to you first thing in the morning because you need to get a good night's sleep. And this mom talking to me, she was like, but what if my daughter's 8th grade friends needed to talk to her in the middle of the night? Well, what's wrong with your daughter's friends actually talking to their own parents if something is so urgent in the middle of the night? And I guess if you have your daughter's technology and you want to answer the phone at 2:30 in the morning, you can do so. But I didn't convince her. Somehow she believed that her 13-year-old needed to be available 24/7. And we're all familiar with the concern about the possibility of addiction with screen time. In the Screenagers program, there are interviews with parents talking about how much their teenager behavior had changed as a result of all the time online. There's also dialogue with families, and I cannot overemphasize the importance of modeling. So if we want to have a technology-free dinner, mom and dad also need to turn off their devices. Xfinity actually had a great commercial. I wonder if anybody's seen it, where everybody's seated around the table, everybody is on their devices, mom is bringing dinner, but first she pushes a button and it pauses all of the technology. It also interferes with free play. It interferes with exercise. It's definitely connected to some of the problems we have with obesity and young people today. Some tips that schools can share with parents. No screens in cars or bedrooms. And in the car, the navigation system, of course, but it really needs to be on for voice-activated directions. Don't be in a hurry to get your kid a smartphone. I had this conversation with the parents of a 3rd grader, and they were like, well, yeah, she needs one because all of her friends have one. Oh, I'm not sure we want her to have 24-hour internet access. Well, gee, when did I first get internet access? I was in my 50s. And all of this comes down to trying to balance all of this. And perhaps the smartest thing we can do in our families is sit around a table and develop a digital usage plan for our family. And at schools, we need input. My wife was a longtime principal, and when the kids entered the classroom, all of the cell phones went into a little storage, and they were handed back when class was over, so they would not be distracting kids throughout the class. So getting the input from students, and perhaps most of all, sitting down and trying to understand why this is so important to them. And here are just a couple of examples that we've worked through, and there are many of these, but a new 7th grade boy at the school. He's pretty good in basketball. The kids already planning to be on the team aren't sure they really want this new kid at their school. So they start sending him messages online, telling him he's not welcome at school. He's a loser. He doesn't fit in. Nobody is ever going to be friends with him. Now, the new student's parents go to the administration, and they have screenshots of the text messages. This is an example of schools need to get involved. And you're probably all thinking, well, there's no easy answer here. No bodily harm was threatened, so we won't be calling the police department, but we're going to need administrators and counselors involved. There's going to need to be consequences. One of the other things that schools have been criticized for is utilizing what is called a peace table, where somebody tells two kids, you need to work this out. The bottom line is bullying is all about power. It's humiliating. It's nasty. One kid has the power, the other one does not. So this is not something that two kids can work out. There's going to have to be a lot of adult input, and it may not be able to be worked out. It's more that there have to be consequences for the bully and support for the victim. Here's another one. This is a high school one, and now we have an 11th grader who's online a lot and talking about all the stress in her life. She's probably somewhat overly dramatic and emotional, and she tells others she's thinking about ending her life through her digital messaging. Well, some of her friends are probably pretty tired of hearing her complain about everything, and one of them actually encourages her and tells her, just do it. Just end your life. You know, we actually had an incident in Massachusetts recently where the young woman, and of course it was all online, she's basically telling him to do it. Get back in the car. You know you want to die by suicide. Unfortunately, he got back in the car, and he died. And that actually went to court. And that young lady was found criminally liable, although in many ways it's more of a morality issue and how do we reach young people at early ages. So they would never post or say something like that via text messages. So it's very challenging. So back to my example, others have joined in. Here's a question I get a lot. Okay, bullying has to be repetitive, right? Well, somebody posts one thing online. How does that possibly meet the definition of being repetitive? Well, I think it meets that definition when like 66 kids piled on and added to or supported the humiliating message. That's when the consequences of this can really be severe. And I do believe it meets the definition because of all the others. What's the literature say about bystanders online? It basically says the more people that are online, the more people that are joining in, then the less likely anyone is going to say, I don't support this. Let's stop this. It's almost like the fewer people that are involved, the more opportunity for somebody to actually step forward. But this 11th grader is taking this pretty hard, all these things, all these encouragement to just do it, kill yourself, take the last step. Thankfully, the mom happens to discover what's going on, realizing her daughter has been gathering the pills and might have actually taken them. So you can see how this would spill over to school in terms of mom is going to come right to school wanting administrative and counseling help, consequences, parents involved. What can we do to help young people learn from an incident like this? And by the way, I believe strongly, all kids misbehave. We need to always separate their worth as a person from the mistake and misbehavior. And I'm a big believer in consequences and, of course, counseling for young people that would actually encourage somebody to take that next step. The legislation, as I mentioned earlier, every state passed anti-bullying legislation with regards to schools. It's interesting to note that most of that legislation is really within the last 5 to 8 years. I believe South Dakota was the last state to actually pass this legislation, and making it really clear. You got to investigate, you got to do something, you have to write it up, you need to share this with administration, often in our schools, to be honest. We don't really want to investigate and write it up, because if we do, we actually have to send it outside of our building. And about half the states have addressed the issue of cyberbullying. And the California Department of Education has really some very good policies and procedures. They do actually say that a kid involved in cyberbullying could be suspended or even expelled. And I think we know that is clearly a last resort. We want to get to what's going on in that kid's life that's causing them to do this. How can we possibly get them to be more empathetic and engaging in more pro-social behaviors? Here are the most common myths that I encounter. They seek power because they're powerless. They're actually often pretty darn popular, calculating. They know how to get what they want. Sometimes we assume that everybody that is a bully was previously abused, and actually it's much more likely that the victims are the ones that have the history of abuse. It's only a problem for the schools to solve. Certainly it is not. It is a societal problem. And do they outgrow it? Boy, I wish I could say today that all bullies outgrew their behavior, but I don't think we have to look very far to be aware of patterns of bullying in the workplace. So unfortunately, it really can be a lifelong problem. Is it best to fight back? The answer to that is no. Particularly in schools, you fight back and you're the person that they have seen actually take action. Now there may be a very harsh consequence for you. Right here in Florida, we had a dad who was tired of his kid being cyberbullied. He actually jumped on the bus and approached the kid who was the perpetrator, and the dad got arrested. It's really a matter of working with school officials. The other day in a presentation, a dad said, you know, I'm a counselor. I think I could do this. I need to approach the parents of the kid who is cyberbullying my child. And my advice to him was, I don't care how skilled you are in counseling, this is your child. I do not think it will go well for you to approach the parents of the bully. You need to work with the officials at school, or maybe it's happening in the community. Maybe it's at Boy Scouts. Maybe it's at the travel soccer practice. Wherever it is, you have to, as the parent, approach whoever is leading those activities. What are the signs of being cyberbullied? Well, these are pretty straightforward, and these look a lot like signs of depression, withdrawing from others, maybe not wanting to go to school, maybe wanting to stay away from all technology, or being nervous when a text message has come in, somatic complaints. And it's the younger the child, the more likely there will be somatic complaints. And there's absolutely no secret for, that's what I mean, no substitute for knowing every kid well. Parents being engaged in their lives, teachers knowing them well, so we can hopefully spot some of these signs. I pretty well, in previous comments, covered the definition of bullying. Cyberbullying is especially challenging. It's continual. It's hard to escape. Content is shared. It's impossible to erase. And of course, a typical response from a parent when they realize their child is the victim of cyberbullying is to take away all their technology. And in many ways, that's actually punishing your child. And so we want that to be totally a last resort. Suicide and bullying, we could spend a long time on this. I just want to highlight the Suicide Prevention Resource Center summarized 40 research studies saying there is a strong association between bullying and suicide, not a causal relationship, because we can never rule out all of the adverse childhood experiences and the impact of having a mental illness yourself or living with someone who has mental illness or substance abuse. But if I had one overarching thought that I hope everybody will take away from today's webinar, if you know a student is involved in bullying, do not hesitate to ask them directly about thoughts of hopelessness and thoughts of suicide. How can we actually help a student who is bullying others? I believe it's really important that they do have consequences. They understand the consequences will escalate. They need to know that I am sharing this information with all the other adults at school. Everybody will be watching you. And we need to try to get at what are some of the underlying reasons why they are actually seeing the need to bully others. Approaching the parents is difficult. Sometimes I asked teachers, why do we hesitate? Why do we not pick up the phone and conference with the parents of the kids you know to be the bully? As they think about it, they might respond by saying, well, I'm afraid they're going to yell at me. They're going to get angry at me. They're going to get defensive. Many people in schools are familiar with what's called the sandwich approach, where we try to begin with something positive. Then we do need to talk about the problematic behavior. And then we try to end the conference, again, with something positive. And I do believe referring kids that are bullies for counseling and mental health treatment is very important. Getting them involved in pro-social activities, rewarding them when they have improved and are behaving in a nicer manner to others. One of the other things in preparing for this, there was a lot of discussion about we've got to catch early gateway mean behaviors so that kids at a very early age understand the importance of, if you can't say something nice, just keep it to yourself. So bystanders, we talked about them. Talking with them is actually really important. And the research says bystanders often experience anxiety because they know they should have done something. And perhaps the thing that would be easiest for them to do is just let the victim know later, I'm sorry that happened. I'm here for you. It takes a lot of courage to stand up at the moment the bullying is happening as a bystander. Some people have argued that just that term is way too passive. Maybe we should actually use the term witness, because when you're a witness to something, that seems to imply that you're supposed to document it, at least share with an adult what actually was going on. Why don't they get involved? They're uncertain of what to do. They might think that the bully is going to turn on them. They don't want to get ostracized. They're afraid it'll only get worse. Or they're thinking, really, there's nothing adults can do. And one of the great concerns I have is that sometimes it appears that young people live in a world where the adults do not exist. And that was certainly one of the major themes that was inappropriate in the program 13 Reasons Why. Adults are involved and need to stay involved in meaningful ways in kids' lives. And responding to a lot of tragedies in schools, even with high school kids, some of our activities have been to ask, like, high school kids, after this tragic event, what do you need? What will help you? And uniformly, I get, I want the adults in my life more involved. So it's really critical that teachers and parents stay involved. And one of my favorite things to ask a kid is it's this simple. Who's your go-to adult at school? Who's your go-to adult in the community? And if they can't identify them, we've got a problem. And relationships are critically important in schools, and identifying, going go-to adults for kids. So very specifically with cyberbullying, it's been described as a slippery, time-consuming slope. Yet we all know we have to set it up so kids will report and let us know what's going on, so we can support the victim, so we can investigate, let everybody know the behavior is not acceptable. And when somebody is actually threatening bodily harm, that's when we involve the police. And a dean of students just last week was talking about how important the collaboration and involvement with the school resource officer is when cyberbullying is happening and impacting learning at school. I mentioned earlier the idea that we just tell these two kids, you need to work this out. That is not appropriate because one person has all the power. Sharing the information with other staff so everybody is alert is very important. And letting the victim know we are here for you every step of the way. And most importantly, we have to let them know you do not deserve this. You are not bringing this upon yourself. This is not your fault. We are going to get this stopped. Unfortunately, sometimes even well-meaning adults imply that, well, if you just didn't do this or that, it wouldn't be happening so much. Student involvement is the key. Where should we begin? How about a survey? In particular, it would be a great idea to survey middle school students. First of all, find out any areas of the school where they don't feel safe. Find out any areas of the school building where they're being bullied. But ask direct questions about cyberbullying, how frequently it is happening. In fact, the key thing is really student involvement. And this term, digital citizenship, it's basically realizing we need to set a good reputation online. We need to be responsible. We need to realize how easily things that are posted can be a miscommunication, how hurtful they can be. And we can have anti-bullying pledges that include pledges against cyberbullying as well. An anonymous means of reporting. I was most recently in Colorado, which is a leader with a state program called Safe to Tell. It's 24 hours a day. It's anonymous reporting. Bullying, according to the executive director, Susan Payne, is always number one or number two with regards to the frequency of the reports. So all schools and all states, in fact, the Safe to Tell from Colorado is an incredible program that other states should look at in terms of establishing something similar. So what is this digital citizenship, and when do we need to start it? We need to start it the first time a kid is sitting down at a computer and going over how can they be safe on the internet? How can they be careful about information they share? How can they be thoughtful about what they post? And probably something that a lot of the adults do is when you're thinking of firing off a quick email to somebody, you reflect on it. Maybe you actually write it. And then maybe you read it a couple of times. And maybe you are very careful about the tone. And was it a little bit stronger than you intended it to be? And these are all the kind of skills that kids need to learn as well, but it is so quick and can be so impulsive. And one other really key term about technology is basically self-control. Self-control in terms of realizing the importance of limiting this, as well as realizing I better think carefully before I respond and I post something that might have a very negative tone. So I would highly recommend that everybody listening visit Common Sense Media, and I'll share their website in a few minutes. But K-12 curriculum, they are all free, and things that we could be doing in schools. For example, at my wife's middle school, they had a digital citizenship program. The other day, a principal shared, well, we don't do it in classrooms, but we do in assembly. But then I might respond by saying, great start, but we've got to follow up in classrooms, and it's something that a one-time thing is not going to be enough, something that we need to have a developmental plan throughout our entire K-12 schools. Showing respect for others online, incredibly important. This term trolls are those people that are actually just online looking for ways to hurt and insult others. There have been a number of really tragic incidents where young people did die by suicide, and the cyberbullying was certainly a contributing factor. One of the saddest ones was the young woman from Canada. Some of you have seen the YouTube she made where she's not talking to anybody, but she's showing card after card about her struggle and how she went from mom's house to dad's house in another town. Somehow everything followed her. Somehow all the kids at school got all of these messages about her background and her problems and how hurtful it was. And every time one of my students shows that or talks about it in my classes, I'm just always like, where were the adults? Where were her mom and dad? Where were the teachers? Where were the school counselors? How can all this be happening time after time, month after month, and no adults are intervening? There is the link for Common Sense Media, and as I said earlier, it is really an excellent program, and I very much hope everybody listening will, in fact, visit the website, look at their free digital citizenship curricula. What if my child is the one that school staff are telling me is cyberbullying others? And hopefully they used the sandwich approach, so it wasn't all about everything my kid's doing wrong. In fact, I actually believe that all kids do far more right than wrong, and we do need to compliment them for all the things they do right. Well, but we need the parent to take it seriously. We need to provide consequences. We need to increase supervision. We need to be clear about the expectations we have for our child's online behavior. We need to build on their strengths, and we need to share information with the school. And I hope that parents always see the school, the administration, the counselor, the social worker, all as sources of help, because I sincerely believe that everybody in education is there because they care about children. And often it's a matter of communicating, increasing the circle of care, and providing interventions and support for kids. But what if your child is the victim of the cyberbullying? Well, I've already said I don't recommend you take action and you go confront the bully or confront the bully's parents. You need to work with school and community leaders, and most of all, you need to support your child. Remember the statement, you don't deserve this, we're going to get this stopped. I'm going to be there for you every step of the way. Let them know the bullying is wrong, but don't immediately take away their technology because they will feel like they are being punished. And since it is your child and you're probably very, very upset, sometimes it's a good idea to take some deep breaths, relax, don't immediately grab the phone or charge anywhere. think and plan about how you want this interaction to go. And I'd be remiss today not to mention one of the tragic cases. That would be the case of Megan Meyer. Some of you probably know that as the MySpace case, but Tina Meyer has founded the Megan Meyer Foundation in memory of her daughter Megan, who did die by suicide, and the cyberbullying that she received was certainly a very big contributor to her death. So that'll be very easy to find. Just Google the Megan Meyer Foundation. M-E-I-R is how Meyer is spelled. Who should I contact at school? Well, I think it's always best to start with the teacher. Maybe the teacher's response isn't as much as you would hope as a parent. Then we've got to get other staff involved. That might involve the assistant principal. It might involve the counselor. But we've got to get a commitment from everybody that this is going to stop. How can children become more resistant to bullying? At the simplest level, we want every kid to find their niche. What is it they really enjoy? What is something they're very good at? What is an experience, an activity where they feel valued, supported, and very successful? So that's really important to find that for all young people. Help them build friendships. Sometimes the difference between being miserable and being pretty well adjusted is just having one good friend. And also realizing when does a kid need to go to an adult for help. And we want schools and our homes to be welcoming and safe places where kids feel protected, valued, and loved. And we want them to always talk to us. And the other day, one of the students in my graduate classes, who's a teacher, was talking to an assistant principal, and she's saying, you know, I really need to talk to the kids in my class. Oh, and more importantly, I really need to develop relationships so they'll talk to me because that's really, really important. And the assistant principal responded by saying, you're not the counselor. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't think we have enough counselors to go around. And we do need to find times in our classrooms, in our school cafeterias, on our sports teams, in our homes. When will the kid truly talk to the adults in their life? And we need to be very careful not to respond with, do this, do that, you won't have a problem. That's not what kids want at all. They just want to be listened to and to have us say, that's a hard one. I'm not sure. What are you thinking you should do in that situation? They want us to listen to them. The protective factors, and please be thinking about what questions you have for me, but these actually come from the World Health Organization. And obviously, we want this for every single kid in our country. We want them in a stable and cohesive family. Unfortunately, that's not the case for a lot of kids. But how do we make sure that the adults, the mom and the dad, don't constantly put the kid in the middle of everything? And it's quite simple, actually. Mom and dad brought these children into the world together, and they should always be civil and respectful of each other and recognize they are going to be partners forever in parenting their children, and everybody needs to be nice. Coping and problem-solving skills and impulse control, very, very important for overall well-being. And we want a school climate where social and emotional wellness matters. I actually think it is the foundation of actually being a successful student. When you've just been bullied or harassed in the hallway, it doesn't matter how good the lesson is because you can't think about anything else except what just happened to you. So we really have to make creating a safe, welcoming, bullying bullying-proof environment very, very important in all of our schools. And access to mental health care is critical for young people. And how do we get past the stigma that stops so many families from getting mental health treatment for their child? And researching a presentation the other day, I found statistics that said something like this. Parents who do, in fact, take their kid for mental health counseling in the community, about 60% of them stop the counseling after 2 or 3 sessions. I'm sorry, but they need to give it more time. And I'm a big believer in counseling can make the difference. And as stated earlier, helping kids identify who are the trusted adults they would go to for help. Best practices for schools to review: we got to start early. We got to teach kids to be responsible online. We got to put bullying prevention and cyberbullying prevention and procedures in the handbook. And we really need to go over it with students. We need to go over it with parents. It's not enough to just expect everybody's going to read this and understand it. And then wouldn't it be great if those of you listening after today said, hey, how about if we start a task force, a bullying prevention and a cyberbullying prevention task force at our school? Let's look at the things that we're doing that are working. Let's look at maybe some things we need to add. Let's look at how we could get parents to be more partners in our anti-bullying programs. And then back to student involvement. They are the most powerful element in any prevention plan. And do all of our staff members recognize the warning signs of kids that are being cyberbullied? And in one of the legal cases I was involved in, I want to quote the nurse for you. All they ever asked me to do was put on the Band-Aids. The nurse is a critical part of the circle of care. And kids are going to be going to the nurse with somatic complaints, maybe some strange injuries, and the nurse needs to get with the counselor, the teacher, the assistant principal. And by the way, in the Lance versus Louisville ISD case in Texas that went all the way to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court after the tragic death of Montana Lance, I believe if they'd had that circle of care, there would not have been the suicide of a 9-year-old student at school. I think I pretty well covered recognizing the association between bullying and suicide. A couple of more general practices. We can't just rely on our teenager to be the total technology guru. We may think we're monitoring their social media. They may have entirely different accounts that we don't know anything about. There's also what are called super routers that can be purchased for the home, where the parent can basically monitor all of the Wi-Fi activity in their home. Perhaps most important, sitting down, getting student input, first of all, about technology usage at school, but very importantly also about technology usage and expectations at home. Very critical. Here are some resources that I think are really important. Common Sense Media, I've talked about a lot. Cyberbullying.org also has a wealth of information. And the U.S. Department of Education's website is Stop Bullying Now at stopbullying.gov. And then an excellent book that I found really helpful, Bullying and Cyberbullying, What Every Educator Needs to Know. And we need to realize we have a critical role to play. It does impact learning. That is our primary business. That's why we must get involved, talk to students, conference with parents and take action. So I'm going to turn it back to Kathy to see what questions might have come in.
Well, thank you, Scott. That was very informative. I do have a few questions that we've received, but I've got to read the disclaimer first. So Keenan & Associates is an insurance brokerage and consulting firm, not a law firm or accounting. We do not give legal advice or tax advice, and neither this presentation or the answers provided during the Q&A or the documents constitute or should be construed as legal or tax advice. You're advised to follow up with your own legal counsel to discuss how this information affects you. So while I ask the questions, I'm going to go back and post the picture with the resources on there because all three of those are just fabulous. One question that we seem to get multiple times is, can you speak about apps that are posted and allow the students to post anonymously, or the apps like Whisper that disappear after X amount of minutes or seconds?
Well, this is an example, Kathy, of the incredible challenge that we face in terms of we're trying to keep up. Like maybe some people listening just got a Facebook account and kids are on to all these other things. I think the most important thing I would suggest is the IT person on your campus or the IT person for the district. They are often young people and incredibly competent and up to date. They are the ones that can answer these really difficult questions. And I would love to see more school districts have meetings for parents. And I'll just give you an example of, in Colorado recently, there's a documentary out there called Screenagers. The high school auditorium had 500 seats. I am told in 3 hours, every seat was reserved. And my job was to lead a discussion afterwards. And I had the IT person for the district there to help answer some of these complicated questions that only the experts have the answers. But at a preventative level, let's talk to kids about all of these dangers and what is appropriate and what is inappropriate.
Excellent. And I do know that one of your resources, the cyberbullying.org, about every quarter they put out the latest and greatest apps, and it's written in terms for parents and educators so they're aware of what's coming out to help them be one step ahead of where these kids are going. Thank you. Another question we received is, what if the school, because of budget cuts, got rid of a lot of their SRO, the school resource officer? Do you work with the police department, and who at the police department do you really work with?
All right, well, that's a very important subject that's been brought up, and it has been rather frustrating that school safety budgets nationally have been cut for some time. Many districts have also reduced the budgeting for school resource officers, and I am a very big fan of them. And school resource officers know the importance of developing relationships with kids and being in classrooms and talking to kids about preventative things. So now, what about the local police? Hopefully we could at least get the police chief to essentially have a key contact person that schools could rely on with some of these questions. And to me, where it crosses, there's always the need for consequences and investigation. But where it reaches the point where the police need to be notified and involved, that is when a kid fears for their safety and somebody has posted something that actually is about intending bodily harm. That's when the police must be notified. We can't always control their response, but we can certainly make the call, and the superintendent of schools and key administrators could have a conference with the local police in a preventative way. Let's talk about cyberbullying. Let's talk about how you can be of help to us. How can we decide when you should be called? What could you do for us? So that would be really good crisis planning. Have some of those meetings in July or August before kids come back to school, and even reviewing, okay, we had cyberbullying issues last year. Were we satisfied with our response? Could we have reached the parents more effectively? Did the SRO or the local police help us? How could we improve our response? Because the problem is going to continue.
I agree. Well, unfortunately, the kids, I mean, these inventors of the apps are just so clever. And they've even got apps now that a sender can use that'll change the phone number so that the counselors, the administrators at schools can't identify who sent that message. What do you do then?
Well, really incredibly challenging. And I think if we were to try to get at the most fundamental point here, that involves parents. That involves parents demanding to know, checking phones, checking social networks anytime, not essentially. You know, when I talked about talking to sixth graders' parents, the problem is I should have been talking to the second and third graders' parents, because by sixth grade, unfortunately, it's sort of like the kids have been given the keys to technology, and parents, many of them are no longer paying attention. So I think we have to begin at really early ages and not be in such a hurry for our kid to have smartphones and all this access to technology. And I think most parents would acknowledge my relationship with my kid has deteriorated because they spend all their time with the technology. Sometimes they even say, we went to Hawaii. All my kid wanted to do was be on his technology. Well, before you buy your kid a ticket to Hawaii, here are the rules. Here's what's going to happen. If you don't agree with this, you stay behind. We'll go to Hawaii. So I think we've got to have some really hard conversations in our families and really take control of this. And if we do that, we will allow schools to be able to focus on a lot of other things that have been more traditional in terms of kids learning.
Perfect. I've got 1 minute and one question. So if a student, quote, likes a comment, a bullying comment made by another student, should that person who liked that be held to the same consequences as those making the initial comment?
Well, it is certainly worrisome, and this is exactly what makes the impact of cyberbullying so severe. And again, to try to be proactive, we need to discuss it in classrooms. We don't need that specific example, but how about if my sixth graders today, we spend a little time, what's that mean? What do you think, class, when somebody does that and say they like the hurtful comments? Is it the same? What could we do to stop doing that? And one thing I heard in a presentation in Missouri 2 weeks ago, the dad said, we have a topic every night at the dinner table. Of course, there's no technology, but wouldn't this be like a perfect topic for a parent to bring up? And let's get the input from all of our children. What do you think? And I think we as adults would respond by saying, it's hurtful. It adds to the problem. No, you didn't start it, but you did have an opportunity not to participate or maybe even to try to turn the comments in a more positive direction. And I think this is where that anxiety comes in, because I think most kids know that it wasn't the right thing to do to agree and post a like to a hurtful comment.
I agree. Well, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Poland, for your fabulous insight and expertise on this topic, and thank you to all who have joined us this morning. We will be posting the PowerPoint and the recorded session on our Keenan.com site, so look for that in the future. Thank you again, Dr. Poland, and we appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. Have a good day, everyone.